Hello everyone, and welcome to Special Session C, Digitalisation and Economic Measurement. I'm Richard Hayes, I'm Deputy Chief Economist at the ONS, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this session of the ESCO conference. We have an hour and a half to talk around all things digital. We have two giants of the field, Diane Coyle and Owen, who will be presenting their papers, alongside one from the ONS on telecoms that I will be presenting. Digitalization is one of the four key questions in the System of National Accounts work program at the moment to think about changes to go into the SNA alongside globalization, communication, well-being and sustainability. And it continues to be very much a live topic and key topic for thinking about how national accounts needs to adapt to measure the modern economy. I'm not going to use much more time to give this an introduction, just to say at the bottom center of your screen, if you go full screen, you will find a button called Q&A. If you wish to ask a question, please feel free to hit the button, enter your question. We will then pick questions, draw questions out, and you will be taken off mute when you're invited to present your question. So there is no chat facility you might see. We're doing this through the Q&A button, which is the center bottom of your screen for those of you in the audience. So without further ado, each of the speakers is going to take around 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes for questions after each speaker. And so I will hand over first to Diane Coyle, who's going to talk to us about the impact of new goods and increasing variety on economic measurement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Richard, and hello everybody. So I know we should all be getting used to Zoom life at the moment, but it's still a little bit odd speaking into the ether, but here goes. So I'm talking about new goods and variety, which is something that's been made particularly acute by the impact of digitalisation on the economy, although these problems are not new problems. We've known about them for many years. And the paper I'm talking about is for a forthcoming Brookings Institution volume on productivity. And so the context here is that I was thinking about the implications of new goods, variety and quality improvements for the measurement of real output and hence productivity. And the first question when I started thinking about this was how much variety is there in the economy now? And the answer is it's actually quite hard to tell because we don't collect statistics on varieties. So rooting around, I found a few indicators, and here are a couple of them. The left-hand panel is from the US Department of Agriculture based on Mintel data, market research data, and it shows the number of new goods in US retail outlets divided into food and non-food. And you can see the trend there. There was some increase in the late 1980s and early 90s, and then a big increase again from 2000, and possibly a recent increase again as well. And the second panel is from a paper by Gerald Wolfogel in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, looking at digital products in particular. And so he gives examples of music and feature films and a couple of others that I can't remember at the moment. But they've all got this basic shape. You see that there was a general gentle upward trend up until sometime in the mid-2000s, and quite a large acceleration since then, reflecting in the case of feature length video, the Netflix phenomenon also. And I think, you know, everyday experience tells us that the increase in variety has been quite substantial. If you think about some items of consumer goods, such as expensive trainers or computers, there's extreme personalization available now. And also in things like medical services, where there are kind of space age phenomena coming along, such as the ability to grow personal organs for transplant patients. Not quite in the shops yet, but personalization is a phenomenon, part of this phenomenon as well. You can see the kind of evolution with the iconic digital product, the mobile phone. So on the left here is the kind of mobile that was available in the early 1990s. In 1991, Chancellor of the Exchequer Norman Lamont introduced a yuppie tax on handsets, which only lasted for a couple of years because that's how they were seen at the time. And of course, there were prior technologies also. There were the wireless networks. And in the 1970s and 80s, you'd had rail engineers driving around testing the pattern of over wireless waves. And also the chips, which are in the news again with the sale of ARM, which is one of the main manufacturers of mobile chips. There were then constant improvements. So that's a bit of a brick of a phone. My first phone I got in something like 1993, and it was a large candy bar phone. They got smaller, we got clamshell phones. And then in 2007, on the 29th of June, there was that moment when Steve Jobs launched the iPhone, launched the smartphone. $500 for the first of those. Many of them in sequence ever since, and the competing Android phone handsets, and an extraordinary explosion since 2007 in access to smartphones that also goes alongside all those enabling technologies, improvements in networks 3G and 4G, and perhaps one day 5G as well. So by 2008, 17% of UK adults already had a smartphone. 4G got launched in 2012, apps became a thing. And of course, all through this period, since 2007, we had things like the camera, the calculator, the watch on the smartphone. So all of those analog products that we no longer needed to buy if we didn't want to. And then by 2020, 80% of UK adults have a smartphone now. And I've shown you the picture of Apple Maps as one of the apps in 2012. From 2013 onwards, we saw the launch and spread of apps like Waze, which I've shown here, which isn't just a static app, it's got real-time information services. And there's a production element of that by the app provider, which is Google in the case of Waze now, Alphabet rather, but also the consumers, the users who are generating that data in real time. And so this maps the progress of the data economy and this succession of, well, you could decide to classify them as new goods or as improved quality or as even in some aspects changes in variety. And I think the point of that is that there isn't actually a huge conceptual difference between these. You're talking about differences in scale rather than differences in kind. And it's a bit custom and practice whether we treat things as new goods, which we tended to do with the mobile phone and the smartphone, or as increases in variety, which tends to be the case with groceries. So as I mentioned, this is an old problem. Since the 1960s, people have been worrying about what to do about quality change in calculating price indices. And so there are a number of adjustments that statistical agencies use. This table is taken from an ONS publication about the adjustments used in the UK CPI. And so for a quarter of them, it's none. Roughly half some kind of class mean imputation matching type models, very small proportion hedonic adjustment in the UK, and then a number of other practical adjustments reflecting things like depreciation and size changes. The practice is different between different statistical agencies. So in the US, for example, there's much greater application of hedonics, and it applies to different goods. So not just the kind of technology goods that I was talking about and that ONS considers, but also goods like clothing, and other countries do hedonic adjustment of different types of goods again. And I think the message is of this practice that actually it's quite complicated, but also it's a matter of judgment. And just as with there being no sharp distinction between new goods and quality improvement, actually there's no science about which kind of quality adjustment you apply to which kinds of goods. There's judgment involved as well. A key recommendation of all the various studies that there have been, be it the Stigler report in 1961 or the Boskin Commission report in 1996, was to get new goods into the index faster. And a logical conclusion of this has been chain weighting, which replaced fixed year base weights, which were problematic when the structure of production and consumption and therefore prices were changing rapidly, as with computers in the 1990s. And every time you change the base year of the data, of course, you change the history of GDP growth. But that point about changing the history, the stories we tell ourselves about the path of the economy, is also true of chain weighting. And if you're chain weighting, if goods and services whose relative price is declining then have a smaller impact on GDP growth after the base year. The chain aggregates have slower growth after the base year compared to before, and slower growth than the fixed base. And there's a very graphic demonstration of this in a paper by Carl Whelan, Journal of Money, Credit and Banking, where he did this calculation for US real GDP and a fixed weight index with 1992 fixed weights and a chain weighted index with chain weighting subsequently. You can see that's quite a dramatic difference. It's roughly doubling GDP growth by the end of the period to keep that, that fixed rate approach. And in one sense, that tallies with the stories that people were telling about the US economy in the late 1990s, that it was a period of very rapid technological evolution and adoption of new technologies in production methods and in consumer activities. And so that's sort of intuitive. But paradoxically, in a way, introducing the chain weighting made it look as though that natural story that we were telling ourselves at the time wasn't feeding through to real GDP growth. And so the message I take from this is that we need to get away from the idea that there is one single story about the history of the evolution of growth and productivity. The question all this raises is what to do about it. And there are a number of possible approaches. So one is to do more hedonic adjustment. And we saw that in the UK, there's not much done. One could think about extending that and identifying for more digital goods or for more consumer goods generally, as they're affected increasingly by digitalization, an extended hedonic approach, assuming that you can find the data on the characteristics that you think are important and that the statistical production process could be set up and that would be worthwhile. A second approach is to think about using faster access to data online and big data in effect for doing more matching models. I don't think that really gets you around the issue I was just talking about, but there are a number of people now looking at that kind of approach as the data becomes more readily available. You can think about improving the indices sector by sector, particularly those that are dramatically affected by digitalization, and that's Richard's paper later in this session, so I'm not going to preempt any of that. Another approach in literature, which is not about statistical production, has been to think about the welfare instead and calculate estimates of consumer surplus based on Hicks's 1940 concept of a reservation price. So if you can figure out econometrically what price would set demand to zero for a certain product or a certain new variety, then you can figure out the consumer surplus above the actual price. That's very data intensive and labor intensive, so there have been a number of examples of that in the literature. Famously, Jerry Hausman's Apple Cinnamon Cheerios and the great consumer welfare that came from the introduction of that new variety. But that's, of course, quite arduous and not something that you can think of applying in price indices anyway, because the expenditure data that's needed becomes available too slowly. And then a final one, again going down the welfare route, is to think about just direct estimation of consumer valuations, which Eric Brynjolfsson and his colleagues, Avi Collis and Kevin Fox, have applied to free digital goods, zero market price digital goods. Of course, we pay for the technology that we use, the broadband subscriptions that we use, but the goods themselves are free. So they introduced the idea of using contingent valuation methods to directly estimate willingness to accept loss of those goods. And David Nean this morning in a great presentation talked about some work that he and I have been doing, looking at extending that to other types of free goods as a way of benchmarking it and thinking about some of the issues that the methods raise, including how do you add these values up. But the suggestion there is to calculate those for the right range of goods and create a new aggregate, a GDPB, Eric and his colleagues called it, which will give you a wider welfare estimate than real GDP. So this is something that people are very actively thinking about. But for me, it raises quite a philosophical question. Some people listening might have heard me use this quote before because I like it so much. Thomas Schelling, what we call the real magnitudes aren't real, only the money ones are real, the real ones are hypothetical. And I think this raises the question of what it is we're trying to do with these measures and thinking about real output and productivity. In a 1994 AER paper, Zvigrilicus calculated what he called measurable sectors of the economy and hard to measure ones in the context of thinking about real output and productivity growth. And I have extended his table by adding a 2019 column. So the first 2, 4, 6, 5 columns come from Zvigrilicus' paper. The last one is my addition to it using the latest US national accounts. And he counted agriculture, mining, manufacturing, transportation, utilities as the measurable sectors. So their share of the economy had declined from almost half in 1947 to under a third by 1990. We might now classify some of manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, which is incredibly digitalized, parts of utilities, telecoms being the obvious example, as hard to measure as well. But even if we stick with the original sectors, it's under a quarter of the economy now and falls into that classification measurable. So 3/4 of the economy is therefore hard to measure in the sense that it's just very difficult to understand through deflation what the real output and real productivity of those sectors are. And there are a number of examples to help us think about this. So one that I owe to Leonard Nakamura is, what do we think about a new idea leading to a new product or service when nothing physical changes? And so his great example is the use of 2 medications for wet macular degeneration. Avastin is the licensed approach. Lucentis is not licensed for that, but for other conditions. But it turns out to be a cheaper and probably better treatment. So nothing has changed. It's been an idea, but actually the welfare implications of that are quite significant. How should we think about that in terms of prices and real output and productivity? Well, you could argue that you just wait for the expenditure shares to change and treat that in price indices in the same way. Not clear to me that that captures the whole of the change in the consumer surplus, the whole of the change in welfare that occurs. Another example is exactly the free digital services, bundled together with other positive priced products, although they have a zero price themselves. And you could think about something like the price of a roadmap that we all used to have in our car versus the price of the navigation aids that we switch to, the GPS navigation aids, versus the price of using Waze and getting a much higher quality navigation service because of the extra consumer data, the extra user data that is making that service so valuable in real time. And so we need to think about what are the substitutions that have occurred along that chain of products, and do we have the data to think about that and put that into price indices in the conventional ways. And then finally, there are more and more goods and services in the economy where it's just not obvious how to think about the price volume split that we traditionally apply. And this table comes from a chapter that I wrote for the ONS online statistics book. And so it divides the prices that we do observe and the prices that we can't observe, and then whether we observe quantity, whether we observe quality or not, and whether both are unobserved. And so here are some examples. If we observe price, quantity, and quality, we've got the conventional market goods. I suppose you might think about a car. If you don't observe price, then we've got the sort of barter transactions that are occurring in the data economy. If quality is unobserved, that's the case with many services and the imputations that I've put in the table on the right-hand side there. And then we've got examples where actually we just don't observe enough to divide the revenue statistics that we clearly do observe into the different components. So here there are very digital examples, but I think this is true of some digitalized services such as management consultancy, where it's really not clear what a unit of management consultancy is, and the price is the best indicator of quality that you might have, although it's not clear how effective an indicator it is. Or even haircuts, where we can probably measure the volume of haircuts, but not the price again gives the signal of quality in itself. So I'm going to leave you with some questions to which I don't really have the answers, but I think it's the kind of things we ought to be thinking about now. And one is really quite fundamental, that if we think only a fifth or a quarter of the economy at best is, quotes, measurable, do we have the right framework for thinking about measurement? Should we be thinking about even quite radical approaches to see how far that takes us? One example on which I've been working with Leonard Nakamura is thinking about time use, both as a welfare indicator, because we know quite a lot about the well-being people attribute to different uses of their time, and also potentially as a productivity indicator. If price indices aren't a good way to measure economic welfare, and we have a lot of people suggesting that there are large unmeasured welfare improvements coming about because of digitalization, raises a question for me about why we're putting a lot of effort into doing quality adjustment of price indices. What is the question that we're trying to answer with those? Because if it is about welfare, we're only getting partway towards answering it. Then I think looking back at the changing base stories and the chain weighting drift, the chain drift story, what are the implications of different approaches to deflation for our understanding of productivity over time? And I think there's a task to be done to go back and think about what different stories would we have told about the economy if we had used different approaches to deflation over time. And then finally, a question, again, I'm starting to think about this, about quality adjustment and affordability, because the quality, even if your product is much higher quality than it used to be, you still have to be able to pay for it. And for people on low incomes, it's no good having access to free digital services if you can't afford the smartphone or the broadband subscription in the first place. So I'm going to leave with my questions to you, and I think it's now time for your questions to me. So let me just stop the screen sharing.
So there are no open questions in the Q&A yet. So anyone who feels free, do please enter a question. Whilst we are whilst we're waiting for that, I don't know if you heard that, but a question from me, Diane. A lot of what you've discussed there is thinking about how we measure in terms of taking nominal output, dividing by a price deflator and getting to volumes. But thinking about something like the government sector, thinking about the Atkinson framework of how to measure volume directly, is that an alternative that we should be thinking about, more direct volume measures?
So I think for some goods and services, that's definitely an approach worth exploring. I would agree with that, Richard. It doesn't answer the question about other parts of the economy, such as my management consultancy question. Really, what is a volume unit in many of the services that are quite large shares of an economy like the UK's at the moment? But where it can be done, I think it's worth doing a compare and contrast. And yeah, so I would agree with you.
Now we have a question from Warren Oliver. So shall we take Warren first, please? We should just be taking you off mute, Warren. Did you want to read out your question, please? You might just need to take yourself off mute, Warren.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry. Yeah, so I was asking about the welfare implications of what might be called excessive variety, and gave it as an example the 1970s literature on the ready-to-eat cereal industry in the United States. And, you know, the sort of rhetorical question, how many versions of Cheerios are of significant value?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm a little sceptical about asserting that there is negative value to increased variety. I know there's a psychological literature saying the paradox of choice literature that people can't choose when there's too many things to choose from. But that makes a presumption about revealed preference that, as an economist, I'm a bit uncomfortable with. And so, unless you're talking, the welfare implications of many more varieties of cigarettes, I can go along with that. But the welfare implications of more varieties of cereals are less clear to me. And as you know, the empirical estimates that people do are that there are large positive welfare values assigned to even apparently trivial things like the Cheerios. But you could take that and say, are there too many books being published? Well, probably yes, but I wouldn't want to argue that publishers should be rationing the number of book titles that they publish.
Okay, Leonard Nakamura is next. Fabulous. If you just take yourself off mute, you're on, Leonard.
Hello, Leonard.
Hi, Diane. So really nice talk. I wanted to add a question about measurables, which is, as you were talking, it occurred to me that in many ways, having more quantity is no longer as desirable as it used to be in the days when a lot of people say we're short of food. Now our problem is that there are too many people who are obese, and also our houses are overcrowded with junk, and we need advice on how to stop hoarding and be more tidy. So I'm wondering if even what we can measure in some sense is no longer measurable.
So these welfare questions are really profound, aren't they? And we've got the traditional utility maximization approach with fixed preferences and the assumption of diminishing marginal returns, but positive marginal returns. And I'm with you in thinking that that's probably not a good framework for thinking about welfare. So hence, you and I started to think about time use, which really overturns the presumptions of classic consumer theory and the constant utility framework on which we base price deflators. And so you might add to your argument about more quantity being not desirable, all of the environmental implications of the quantity. And I don't have the answer to these quite deep questions, but I would like to see the profession do some thinking about how we go about assessing economic welfare and measuring economic welfare. And as many people involved in national accounts have been saying in the past couple of years or so, trying to shoehorn welfare measurement into that framework doesn't seem a very sensible way to go about it.
Okay, we've got two more, I think, one from Jonathan Porter and then Bernard Goldhammer. So we'll go with Jonathan first if we can. If you just take yourself off mute, Jonathan.
Hello, Richard. Sorry, has that worked?
That's worked, yes.
Sorry, and Diane, I must apologise. I did mean to ask this question of David earlier this afternoon, but I didn't get the chance. So I thought the point you were making about using measures about willingness to accept to measure consumer welfare is a really interesting idea, but I understand that there are potential behavioural bias issues in relation to the gap that opens up between willingness to pay versus willingness to accept measures. And I just wondered if there's, if you and David have given any thought to how you might address those sort of issues in trying to develop senses of what people's valuation and what their welfare might be from particularly in the case of free services, Facebook and things like that.
So as you say, there's a big gap. Willingness to accept measures are higher than willingness to pay measures. And Cass Sunstein has a paper for Facebook showing that it's a very large gap. And that's true in the environmental literature as well, for other types of free goods. And so I think that's one issue with trying to use this method. Another one, which I just mentioned in passing, was how do you add them up? What's the accounting framework for this? Because we included in our survey non-digital free goods such as parks and free-to-air radio. And these questionnaires use a range of examples of the free goods, some of them named like Facebook because it's so well known, others as a general category, such as mapping applications. And again, it's not clear to me what the right kind of accounting framework would be to make all of those add up. So, and then finally, I think people find it quite easy to rank the different services, but it's not as clear to me that the actual valuations that they put on them are very well anchored, even though we did some piloting of different ranges. So I think it's a really interesting approach, but it's a long way to go before we can think about rolling it out into everyday statistics or economic research.
Okay, we're going to take a final one from Bernard, and then we will give Diane last word, I think. So, Bernard, yes, if you just take yourself off mute. Yes.
So I can see that I'm talking. On the top right it says the name who's talking. Thank you, Diane, very much for this very philosophical presentation, which raises some very basic questions of national accounts and in particular, but also on economic measurement and prices. And I especially liked your metrics about prices, quantity, and quality, whether they are observed or not. And this is a really practical problem, for example, when it comes to service producer prices for a management consultancy, where you don't know what the quality is, and you just hope that the hourly rate that you ask for somehow reflects quality and quantity. At least one question I could point to the direction of an answer. This is about the cost of goods index and quality adjustment. I think the main issue about quality adjustment comes from quantity adjustment. In the UK, you had this example of shrinkflation with Toblerone, when they just out every second triangle, and it still looked the same, but it was only 300 instead of 400 grams. And of course, on a cost of goods index, even that needs to be reflected, because you just get less. So this is where it comes from, and this, I think, why quality adjustment also matters for a cost of goods index, not only for a cost of living index, where it of course more obvious. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Bernard, and I agree with you. If you look back at the table about what ONS does, that's exactly one of the adjustments that is made, and I think raises none of the kinds of philosophical issues that I was talking about a little bit earlier. And I haven't yet posted the slides, but I will do shortly, so anybody can access them. Thank you very much. Thank you for the great questions, everybody.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. So without pause, we're going to move straight on to our second speaker, Owen DeVere, who's going to talk to us about advertising markups and the digital economy. Over to you, Owen. Owen, you might need to take yourself off mute.
Unmute, start video, maybe. There we go. And now do the new share. And now I've forgotten how to do this stuff. Yes. Huh. Well, Can you hear me now, Richard?
Perfectly, thank you.
Okay, well, this is joint work with Kevin Fox. And in contrast to Diane Coyle's talk, which preceded this one, which was a very excellent big picture talk, this is going to be a very small picture talk, just looking at how we could treat advertising in a national income accounting framework. There's quite a bit of controversy on this, so I will just step into it. Now, I wonder if I could make this screen smaller. Anyway, it probably doesn't matter much. Our basic message here is that advertising creates a lot of problems with our basic economic price-taking methodology for measuring productivity. Why is that? Well, advertising is shifting demand functions, and if producers take that into account, which they obviously do, or otherwise they wouldn't advertise, we get into a monopolistic competition framework, and our existing economic approach to measurement of productivity doesn't really deal with that adequately. So we're just going to put out some ideas here on how to proceed. This is not the complete picture by any means. It's just some suggestions for a possible approach to the treatment of advertising. So basic idea of advertising is that you're allowing consumers to find out about your products, which they otherwise don't know. Traditional economic theory assumes that everybody has perfect information and makes rational choices on that basis. Well, in fact, of course, you know, as Diane just shown, there's tens of thousands of products out there, and we obviously don't know about all of them. So advertising, in our view, is all about consumers discovering your product. So the traditional competitive model of producer behavior isn't quite appropriate here, and we'll try to show what changes are necessary to take this into account. But as I said, this is not going to be a complete story. So we're going to do some algebra here. We're looking at a firm that sells products at prices P. So P is a vector of the prices that the firm, for its products that it sells. W is a price vector for its inputs. The quantities of outputs are denoted by the vector Y and inputs by the vector X. There's a period T cost function for the firm. And here we're willing to accept that firms are behaving more or less competitively and take input prices as given. And they have a period T technology set ST, which is here. And the YX vector belongs to the period T technology. And then we try to minimize the cost of achieving some target vector of outputs Y, given that we face input prices W. So that gives us a cost function. It's a function of the technology, T, for that period, the output quantity vector Y, and the input price vector W. And the firm faces inverse demand functions. In other words, the firm realizes it can perhaps shift the demand for its products by advertising. And so Q here, capital Q, is a measure of advertising effort, which we'll get into in the next slide. P is the vector of prices that will prevail with a certain level of advertising effort, and Y is what you're offering on the market, and P will be the market clearing price vector that the firm gets if it offers Y with advertising effort Q. So there's a vector of these guys, and here's the individual inverse demand function for the first commodity, and so on. Now, there's a production function for advertising. Before I do say anything more, I should say we break up the analysis into two cases. The first case is where the marketing effort is done in-house. You don't go to an external advertising agency, you do your own advertising. So there's some kind of production function for producing the output Q, and that's this function f of x. It should be an f super t of x because there's technical progress in the effectiveness of advertising for sure. So just keep that in mind that this is actually a function of time as well. So there's a vector of k dimensions, capital X, that represents the inputs into the advertising program. And there's a capital W vector that prices out these inputs for the advertising. And then we have a cost function for producing Q units of advertising effort in period T, given that we face input prices for advertising inputs, capital W. So this is where the superscript T should come in here to recognize that there will be technical progress with advertising. That's reflected in this cost function. Now, the firm's overall profit maximization problem is the following one. P is the vector of output prices, Y is the vector of outputs. That's our revenue. And CT, YWT, well, that's your traditional production cost of producing the output vector Y. But then we have the advertising cost as well. And so that has to be subtracted off. And then there's some constraints on this problem, namely that we have to be on our inverse demand functions. So the P, vector of selling prices, depends on the period T demand function, which inverse demand function, which gives us the selling prices that we can get if we offer Y in the market, and we have advertising effort Q. So the idea here is that Q makes consumers aware of your products and hence will generally increase demand or at least not decrease it. So we can replace the P here with the inverse demands and then we get this monopolistic profit maximization problem. Okay, so that's unfortunate because now, we can't assume the competitive model and get the convenience that affords us when we construct national accounts. It's definitely a monopolistic problem. Yeah, so the traditional price-taking competitive model producer behavior is not accurate. And this is true even if the industry technology, the small CT cost function, is subject to constant returns to scale. So this will impact our measurement of firm and industry productivity. And we did some work on this with a monopolistic framework in a paper published in 2008. It's messy because you have to do econometrics. So whenever you have to do econometrics, there's problems. Anyway, we carry on here a little bit with our analysis, assuming first order differentiability of the inverse demand functions, the general cost function, small ct, and then the advertising cost function, big CT. We optimize the whole mess with respect to advertising effort, capital Q, and the output vector Y. So there are going to be some first order conditions for an observed vector YT and QT to solve the firm's profit maximization problem. And there they are. There's one condition for each output. That's this system of equations here. And then there's one more equation for capital Q to determine that. Now, the interesting thing here is these terms here. If we had a competitive market, the prices here the derivatives would be zero. There's a constant price, the market price, and there's nothing you could do. It doesn't matter if you supply more or less of good M. And so then you get price equal to marginal cost, the traditional competitive case. But with monopolistic competition, you get this markup factor interfering with things. Okay, now it's going to turn out that these derivatives here, which occur here and that, if we sum all those guys up, that's going to equal the marginal cost of producing advertising effort. And so that's our final equation here. Okay. So as I indicated, the marginal costs are just these derivatives here. And the total cost of traditional production, excluding advertising, is just inner product of the input price vector and the input quantity vector. If we're doing econometrics, we could assume a differentiable functional form for CT, differentiate it, and get the input demand functions using Shepard's lemma. Now, if we have constant returns to scale in this production function for traditional production, then cost will be equal to a weighted sum of marginal costs, and you know, that's a well-known result. But that's not necessary for the whole picture here. Now, the cost minimization for the advertising effort, again, there's no big surprise here. You just take the inner product of the advertising input price vector with the input quantity vectors that are used to produce advertising. And we can also apply Shepard's lemma there, and we could get a system of econometric estimating equations for this whole business, and we could try to estimate the markups and blah, 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 blah. Well, the thing that emerges here is that the unit cost of producing advertising, oops, this should be a capital WT, is an imputed price for a unit of advertising in this framework. That's somewhat useful because when we go to the second case where the advertising is done by purchasing it, it's hard to get a measure of the quantity of advertising. There are many different ways you could do that. By having it in-house, we kind of bury the QT part. It turned out that it cancels out in the whole big picture, and we don't actually have to worry about it too much. Or alternatively, we can build up that price by using index numbers in a strategic way. Okay, well, markups. So we get price equal to marginal cost plus the markup. And that leads to a weighted sum of these markups. Let's first define profits. So that's the inner product of price times quantity, what you sell the outputs for. And then you have to subtract the cost of traditional production, and then the cost of the in-house advertising production. And so that's equal to this, and then this, the two cost functions, and we just leave the revenue as it is. And profits is also equal to the sum of the markup factors times the amounts produced and minus the cost of advertising. So if by chance these markups add up to the total cost of advertising, then the profits would be zero. And you have a framework here for traditional productivity measurement for this firm. You just, you know, if you take outputs, output index divided by an input index, you see that you don't have to worry about profits, they're zero. And you could just apply traditional accounting to productivity accounting to this setup. But of course, profits won't be zero. And then you get into the problem of, well, how exactly do we treat the profits in a productivity framework, even a traditional one? So that's a complication. That's we don't have a definitive solution to how you actually do this in practice, and so there would be different ways of doing it. You could treat the profits as a fixed factor and kind of work with that, but that may not be entirely satisfactory. Yeah, so another way of proceeding is to note that revenue is equal to the sum of the two cost functions plus profit. And then you could do decompositions of these cost functions into explanatory factors. That's coming up in the next slide. I have a paper in the Journal of Productivity Analysis where I kind of do this productivity measurement in a cost framework, and that's possible to do. But it still leaves open what we're doing over here on the welfare side. And so that's kind of an unsolved problem. Now here's just the productivity framework that I was talking about. Simple accounting decomposition of the value of output. Doesn't require any assumptions, except we have to worry about, well, how exactly do we treat this profit estimate? And how can we do an economic approach to explaining productivity as opposed to just an index number approach where you take an index of outputs and divide it by a quantity index of inputs and you just leave it at that. Okay, I'm just about through. Now, when you outsource the marketing, then you're introducing your purchased advertising, price times the per unit of advertising times the quantity of advertising purchased, and then you still have your traditional cost and then your pure profits. So the problem here is that the QT appears explicitly. And so then that gets you into the problems of how do you actually measure this output of the advertising industry. Now, Kevin rightly points out that if you aggregate over all firms, then this is an intermediate input and it will vanish, so it doesn't matter what you do. But of course, that doesn't help us to measure the productivity of individual firms. We have to have some way of measuring QT. So that's an open problem with our paper. And here's the indication I mentioned about my paper in the Journal of Productivity Analysis, where you can do a cost decomposition into explanatory factors. And assuming translog technologies, you can actually estimate these different factors using index number techniques. But that still leaves open the welfare implications of this with monopolistic competition. You know, what we really want to do is trace out the implications on the firm side for economic welfare. And with non-competitive behavior, you don't get the nice separation of consumer side separate from the producer side. And so, you know, the analysis here is going to be much more complicated, and we haven't really done it. So that's just about it. I guess a minute or two over my time. Treatment of advertising and marketing, very difficult problem. It's even worse than we've presented because buying durable goods, a person doesn't buy a durable good every period. So advertising here may open you up to, you know, a new model, whatever. And so when you retire your old model, you've learned about this new wonderful product, and then you buy it in a future period. The point is that the advertising will stretch over time, and then you get into this intertemporal allocation problem of allocating the cost over different time periods. So that's an added complication. And that's end.
Thank you. So once again, everyone, questions through the Q&A box at the bottom. We have no open questions yet. So I will start with one, just touching on that very last point. Thinking about the intertemporal nature of advertising and advertising returns, does that take us into a world where we need to be thinking about advertising as a form of capital?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's the fundamental problem of accounting. How to decompose the cost of some sort of durable service or good over the time periods where it yields some sort of future service. And so, you know, there's a huge literature on that.
Excellent. We have our first question in from Bernard. So Bernard, if you come off mute, you should be able to go straight into your question.
Yes. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Owen. This is Bernhard. Thanks for your very nice, very macroeconomic, I would say, or microeconomic lecture. My question would be, because you just focused on advertising or marketing, but actually every firm also has other, in business administration terminology, fixed costs, like running the enterprise facility that the light is burning, like legal services, like human resource department, things like that. Isn't this not rather a general problem of production theory, not taking into account these fixed costs?
Yes, it is. I guess our point is that this is a more complicated problem than usual because it involves trying to measure shifts in demand functions. And then if you get into the intertemporal implications of this, I mean, it gets very complicated very quickly. So, yeah, right on. I mean, there are all kinds of fixed costs, and you get into different principles for allocating these costs. Mostly we use the matching principle. You try to make the allocation proportional to the benefits received in future periods. And so like for R&D projects, you know, you look at the stream of discounted profits that the R&D project generates, and then you allocate your costs in a somewhat proportional manner. But it's all quite complicated. And it also depends on firm structure too. Is this, you know, what's the proportionate debt and equity, and what's the right rate of return to use on equity? So yes, there are many problems out there, even, you know, using traditional neoclassical economics, which we haven't solved.
Thank you.
Okay, next question from Sanjeev Mahajan.
Can you hear me, Richard?
Yes, I can.
Okay, excellent. Hi, Owen. It's Sam.
Hi.
I think you use words like complicated, etc., and I think you're understating it. I mean, your presentation is excellent, trying to tackle a really difficult area. So I'm not going to ask you anything easy for sure. I've got two aspects. One is the theme about the capitalization. So we've got different types of R&D being now capitalized, the costs of R&D being capitalized. Part of it that will include some advertising and marketing type costs. But advertising marketing costs may cover different types of assets which have different rates of return. The question is, how would you consider partitioning those? And then the second one I've got is a little bit more sneaky and tricky for you. We have advertising and we have products of a very cyclical nature. I've just had a Cornetto ice cream and it's September. It's unlikely I would eat an ice cream in December. And an ice cream maker is likely to have a different form of content of advertising, cost of advertising, regularity and medium of advertising for certain types of the year, and then very different when I think you relate it to a demand function, where clearly in the summer, the demand is very different. So the rate of return on that advertising, even if it was the same advertising during the course of the year, varied during the year, and then the different types of advertising linked to the different rates of return. How would you go about potentially trying to capture that variation, which is obviously not easy? Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Richard.
Well, obviously, I can't answer either question. And so you can kind of see why advertising was written off immediately. I mean, when you get into these complications, it just becomes somewhat arbitrary. And well, traditional accounting doesn't like arbitrariness. They prefer to be, you know, dead wrong, but definite in what they're doing. Us economists, you know, we're willing to consider alternatives, but they have to be plausible and somewhat reproducible. And you can see both your questions. I mean, how are we going to proceed?
I'm going to suggest we've hit past, so I'm going to thank Owen for his presentation there, and I'm going to move us on to the third presentation. Owen, can you just stop sharing?
Yep.
Yeah, I think you've got the wrong number. Apologies, I'm in a meeting, but I think you've got the wrong number.
Sanjeev, we can hear you. Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen.
You can.
Excellent. So this is a talk from a piece of work that I did with Diane, Mohammed Abdurrahman, also from the ONS, and Will Stewart from the Institute of Engineering and Technology. And it's a piece that started 4 or 5 years ago as we were tackling the Bean Review, which raised a series of questions around economic statistics in general, but particularly how we were measuring the modern economy. A couple of quotes there to show the scale of the challenge that we were facing. And particularly how we were thinking about the IT and communications sector. And in effect, as we started this work, we wanted to be thinking about the big live questions about free products, about digital platforms, about all the things which are very exciting in the digital space from a measurement as well as a sort of technology perspective. But before we got to them, we actually found ourselves tackling what seemed to be initially quite a basic question, and rapidly then became far more complex and has taken us a number of years to develop in depth to be ready to now implement into the UK national accounts. So this is a very poor visual of a telecommunications center transmitting bits of data, zeros and ones, through some sort of satellite technology to something like a mobile phone. And that's the part of this game that we're going to look at in depth in this talk, about those bits of data, those 0 1s, a pure intangible product that can't be seen. And really, we're not going to pick up on anything to do with the actual content. We found ourselves often talking about the ubiquitous cat video when we were doing this work. Whether it's that, whether it's a sophisticated economics blog, Google Maps, or Facebook, the actual content we were kind of blind to. The question was simply around how are we measuring the value of the telecommunication sector, the bits. And really we were looking at this prompted by a productivity lens. So this is a graphic showing the pale blue dots show productivity growth up to, in the 5 years up to 2007. The dark blue dots show economic growth in the 5-year, productivity growth in the 5 years up to 2017. And what you'll see there is that 2 industries have gone from having the strongest performance pre-2007, finance and telecoms, down to having 2 of the weakest across all industries in all sectors in the UK. Why that was happening was one of the questions that the Bean Review asked us, and as we came to look at this, we wanted to explore this in more depth. So we started with telecoms. Now this is a picture, basic picture, that compares the telecoms use side, supply side deflator. Sorry, I've got that wrong up there. No, that's use, yeah, okay. The current deflator on telecoms against the growth in bits of data. Yes, it's used. Sorry, I'll show you properly in a second. Against bits of data used in the UK economy. And that's in petabytes on the left-hand side. And what you'll see is a massive growth in output with very little movement in price. Trying to understand this was really the focus of this project. Now, when we began to look at the supply side deflator, which was where we focused our activity, it was fairly easy to immediately see where some of the discrepancies and some of the issues were arising. So this is the CPI for telecommunications services and equipment. Note the equipment bit there, we'll come back to that in a bit, which you'll see does move significantly in a range from about 95 to 125, 130 on this scale. But obviously moves far less than the services producer price index for just services, which falls from around 240 down to just under about 85 by 2017, taking 2010 as the base. Now, actually on the supply side, because the economy supplies both consumers and businesses with this product, these two were weighted together. And this helps to lead to a far flatter profile, as shown before. So in looking to improve this, we developed two key options. The first was a fairly vanilla improvement of the SPPI, looking at the products involved in tackling chain linking. Importantly, more mobile and broadband data had moved more quickly than we had updated the basket, so that was a key addition. The second was more radical and looked at a pure data usage approach, looking at converting all telecom services into its component bits, as described in the second bullet, and composing an aggregate unit value index, which is basically the unit cost of delivering 1 bit of data. And these gave radically different answers. So the current flat deflator on the supply side is shown there in the dark purple. The red is the revised SPPI, and the green was the data usage unit value index. And you'll see there the scales show essentially the same shape, but radically different rates of change. And this was the key question that we took out of what was effectively the first stage of research, and we published that very early in the ESCO's, on the ESCO website, very early in its discussion paper series. And we obviously took away the question of why would these two results give such radically different stories. But we also, as we had engineers involved with us, had a key question about the practicality and the question of actually how was this story relating to what was happening in the market. And in fact, was this in some ways a problem of our statistics facing forward or facing backwards? So the SPPI, based off of weights, off of data you've collected from the past, particularly revenue patterns, revenue weights, gives you a picture of how this service had been used in the past. In some ways, the data usage model gave us a picture of what was going to likely happen in the future. There's a bubble missing in the middle of this as I've converted this to a PDF, but I'll try and remember what's in there. Effectively, the two processes in the purple boxes on the right and left-hand side were suggesting to us that firstly, from a technology point of view, if there's a cheaper technology, you'd expect providers to want to move to use it. So within your mobile telephone, you may have an old style telephony microchip, or you may have a front end that looks like normal telephony, but is using something like a Skype type technology over the internet. As one is cheaper than the other, you might anticipate that providers will move away from the extra telephony chip and just using the internet as a way of delivering this product more cheaply. And equally, you'd expect consumers to want to move to a cheaper service over time. If they can access the same provision in a cheaper fashion, economics suggests that they're going to migrate. Now, there are two issues that stop this. The one that's shown in the red bubble, the bubbling of older technology, the inclusion of that telephony microchip, is one barrier. The second bubble was around fixed cost elements and the degree to which some of the costs, like fixed line charges on your landline, prevented some of this price dynamic, this marginal price dynamic moving, because you've got this large fixed component within the bill. Now, within this, you also had a bit of a national accounts, a key question that we tackle a lot, which is, as Dia mentioned, in some ways, some of our methods are designed around an age of tangible products. And I describe this as the bag of apples problem. In effect, if I buy a bag of 6 apples and I allow one to rot, if I only eat 5, I have purchased 6 apples. 6 apples has been grown in an orchard somewhere, and so national accounts shows that 6 apples is the output and it's what's been purchased. It's balanced on both sides of the accounts. The problem of intangible assets, of intangible goods like telephone calls, is to some degree that if I buy 100 gigabytes of data, as shown on this example contract offer from one of the UK suppliers, if I only use 90 gigabytes of data, that's all they're going to produce. They're not going to pump another 10 gigabytes of data through a satellite because no one's requested it, and in effect, it never gets produced. And if their aggregate costing across the market is based on the actual service that they are producing, should we be using usage as a measure rather than the 100 gigabytes that's on the label of the contract? One of the key things we wanted to check was whether we were seeing something in the UK that we weren't seeing in other countries' data. Was this differential between these two patterns a uniquely UK phenomenon? And so for these countries listed, we were able to access data from the International Telecommunications Union to attempt to run the same type of modeling. We were able to look at mobile on the left and fixed line on the right, quantities of data traffic, again taking 2010 as 100, and you see there, the same rapid picture of growth in every economy. Even the economies which show the smallest rate of growth more than double their data usage over a 6-year period. At the same time, so this is that picture in aggregate, and even countries which were experiencing difficulties such as Greece, we see that data usage recovers even if there is a dip that we observe in the data. Again, we see a very similar pattern to the UK. The UK is in there in sort of middling blue color in the very middle, basically showing a flat line at around 100. Most countries see something that looks pretty much like a fairly stable revenue line. 1 or 2, Portugal show a fall, Hong Kong was an outlier in much of this data, and we think possibly because they were technologically 1 generation more advanced or had onboarded technology faster than some of the other countries in the sample. But putting these together, dividing revenues by data usage to give a unit cost measure, we see a very, very similar pattern. The UK is there at the very bottom of this sweep. 2014, 15, 16, it shows the steepest price changes, but you wouldn't say it was a significant outlier. There's a clear trend open across all the countries that we observed. The margin of difference is going to be affected by different rates of technology update and different regulatory regimes, but the broad pattern wasn't fundamentally different. So in the second stage of research, we therefore wanted to look at what sort of factors could be causing this. And so we looked in the first instance at the 2 fixed elements, the fixed components, which are in the UK data. And effectively asked, were the fixed line access charges, this fixed component, were they real, or should we be reallocating them back into the mix so that in your SPPI, you didn't have this separate fixed price component that showed a different price dynamic to the marginal cost of the different services, telephony, data, and text messages. And the key driver here behind this was actually discussions with the different telephone companies, telephony companies, which suggested that in many ways they did consider, particularly mobile, but even in the fixed line space, they're offering to be a marginal offering, and to a degree they were constructing fixed line charges for the regulator because it was part of how they were meant to supply the data rather than necessarily how they saw the market dynamics working. And so we developed 3 options. I will put the slides up because I am going through them at pace to get through everything. 3 options where we took the fixed line charges, which are broken down using revenue weights in the SPPI, and looked to allocate them across the voice and data services, either using revenue weights again in A1 or in A2 using volume weights. A3 is essentially the same as A2, but extends this into some of the relatively fixed components of the mobile bundle. And in effect, you get pretty much the pattern that you would expect. You see a step transition as you move from pure revenue weights in the red line through increasing degrees of volume weights down to the yellow line until you get to the green line, which is a pure volume weighted index. And we were pleased to see that the intuition of what we expected to happen was occurring. And this obviously then gave us a range of options for discussion with our national accounts colleagues to consider which of these should go into national accounts. And so earlier this year, in one of our articles preparing us for Blue Book and the experimental data set that will come alongside this in November, we published this picture showing the current telecom services deflator in the yellow line. And if you remember, that is that relatively flat line derived from 2/3 CPI, 1/3 SPPI to give this manufactured deflator, as opposed to the improved SPPI. Now, probably the thing I would mention here, which is really important to note, is that if you remember, that SPPI that I showed you earlier already fell quite quickly. And so there is an element of this which is reflected by the fact that we're moving away from this blended basket of the two different price indices to this single line using just the SPPI. One of the things that's in and behind this is that we have, in compliance with European FRIBS regulations, the SPPI is now a business to all deflator. It's not just business to business, and therefore it is a suitable fit. And you'll be able to see the impacts of this new deflator on our experimental double deflated estimates of GDP on November the 4th. So I hope you'll put that date in your diary to see the impact of this into national accounts. So within that experimental data set, there are still some questions that we need to tackle. In particular, if you put in a new supply side deflator, obviously the HHFCE deflator may be doing something different, and so that would induce you to have to achieve a balance through the balancing process. To shortcut this, we're going to be using the SPPI, the new SPPI, on both the supply and use sides in an attempt to understand the sort of first order impact of the work, but we're going to continue to investigate the best way to take this forward. So this experimental data set is there to show the results of our work through double deflation, improving deflators more generally, before we take those into our full published national accounts. Now, one of the key questions that people often ask us around this work is why might this SPPI and the CPI that I've shown you be doing different things in terms of the data that they result in? And I think it is necessary to say that these aren't like for like instruments. I mentioned before that the CPI covers not just telecommunications contracts, but also picks up telecommunication hardware. So your mobile phone handset would be included in the CPI. It wouldn't be included in the SPPI, which only covers contracts. Equally, the CPI is a consumer series, and the SPPI is now business to all series. So it covers business to business as well as business to consumer sales. And finally, as I've discussed, when you're thinking about the deflators that we use in national accounts, we don't necessarily directly just use a price index. There is a conceptual difference between a price index and a deflator, and often we are having to use judgment and additional data where we can find it to help us to fill in that story to create the best deflator for the products that we're working on. And obviously, as we confront this data, that gives us an opportunity to consider that. Now, all of this work sits within a landscape, as I mentioned at the start. Digitalization is one of the big areas that's being tackled, and I thought it was worth saying that within that work, which is ongoing and where we have fed this research into, there are some key questions that are ongoing. Providing guidance on prices and volumes on digital products when there isn't really global advice on prices and volumes in this sort of way, in the way that Europe has in the prices and volume handbook. Through to the way that obviously as you change this deflator, you're going to see impacts across the whole economy, as this is purchased as intermediate consumption by very many industries across the economy. And that fundamental question that Diane was asking at the start of, is this a new good, is it a changing good? Clearer cut when you're thinking about the telecommunications service itself, but when you think about the content and move on to those interesting questions about the content, is Google Maps the same product as the Atlas that I used to carry in my car? Are they definably different? Are they some aspect of a changing view of what a mapping service or map is? There's lots in there, and for those of you who want to see more on this, if you turn to the UNECE website, you'll find all the digitalization, globalization and well-being guidance notes, which are there for comment at the moment, and I do hope you will take a look. And with that, I think my time is up, so I'll ask for any questions.
I think I'm going to field questions for you, Richard, and you've slightly shortchanged yourself, but there's one from Leonard Nakamura already in the box. So Leonard, would you like to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Yeah, this is a question completely from ignorance, but a lot of intangible products have difficulties with geographic boundaries, and I'm wondering to what extent this might apply to telecommunications. That is, presumably, if telecom were cheaper in Germany than in France, say, I have no idea, you could buy your telecommunications service in Germany and perhaps use it in France. Is that a problem? I know that this is also a problem in terms of, where the actual networks are located.
This is an area that the EU, so taking the German-France example, where the EU has been looking at the operation of the single market. And so things like roaming charges, where as you go into different countries, charges used to apply for you to use your phone in another jurisdiction, have been addressed through regulation. So roaming charges, I believe there are now far fewer instances of those. Generally, However, mostly you'll find if you move from country to country, you end up on the network of a company who's operating in that country who has a relationship with your supplier. So in effect, in most instances, obviously at the border, there may be some exceptions. You'll end up using domestically produced telecoms, which will be sold to you via the relationship that the different your company and the domestic company who's supplying you will have. I must admit, thinking about this purely on a domestic basis was challenge enough. I haven't really thought through the depth of how this might impact into trade. There is some trade in this service, obviously, but I'll probably leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see any others in the box yet, so if anybody has a question before we close for the day, do go ahead and type now. But meanwhile, Richard, can I ask you about that divergence between the new index and the household deflator, and ask whether, I hesitate to say this, but more quality adjustment might be part of the answer?
The CPI is already quality adjusted using an internationally recognized method. And it is a really interesting question. I mean, we, as you'd imagine, we've spent some time thinking about this. And I think it is one where it is just a case of, it's why I draw the distinction between a deflator and a price index. Clearly within the CPI context, use of the best practice methodology that's shared internationally to produce the most internationally consistent measure of inflation that we can produce, you know, is a vital function of the CPI. Whereas in national accounts, we're trying to do something slightly different, and obviously, therefore, we're developing deflators and taking account of other data sources as we do. So many of you will work with implied deflators drawn from within the national accounts system, which take account of the pure deflator and another number of other statistical processes that can impact the difference between current and real data. I think where we are with our new SPPI is with a product which addresses many of the key challenges that I think digital throw up and which are really vital for us to think about as a statistical community. It's quite clear to me that the digital agenda, the digital transformation more has effectively moved faster than our capacity as a community to keep pace with it, and that in some ways we're playing a degree of catch-up to bring these updates into our system to improve our SPPI. And actually, this is a broader question. I think most people think that work on measuring the digital economy means looking at IT or software or hardware or telecoms and making specific decisions about specific deflators or specific sources of nominal output data. But actually, I think there's a deeper, more strategic question of it just fundamentally challenges how quickly or how regularly, how frequently we need to be thinking about updating classifications, updating sample frames, updating questions on surveys, to try and keep pace with the degree to which some of these sectors have evolved and changed. Whether it's something like the telecom sector, or through to hotels and the impact of Airbnb, or through to taxis and Uber and Lyft and companies like this, we need to be far more, the message I'm getting is that we need to be far more nimble, and we need to be thinking about how we make these revisions and these improvements on a far faster and regular basis that allow us to to take account of the way the world is changing. Yeah, I'll probably leave it there.
So there are a few more questions, but we've actually run out of time for this session, and I guess people have had quite a long day and we ought to stop on time. I'm going to invite Bernard Goldhammer and Dave Byrne and Jonathan Porter, who've got questions, to email Richard and get answers that way. Terribly sorry that we've run out of time. And Richard, let me hand back to you to close the session.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for sticking with us through to 6 o'clock. I hope you've enjoyed the whole day, and will be returning to us promptly tomorrow. We have 2 more days in the agenda, and I hope you all have a very pleasant evening. Thank you very much, and thank you to Owen and Diane for presenting, and finally thank you to Caroline, who in the background has been making this session work for us and hitting all the buttons. So thank you everybody. Good night.